The candle on the table had been burning for exactly 47 minutes when Mireille Damon decided she was going to do something that might get her killed. She didn't decide it all at once. It came the way most dangerous decisions come, in pieces quietly between one task and the next, while she was carrying a wine bottle she hadn't been asked to open yet and pretending not to hear things she absolutely should not have heard. She was good at pretending. She had been doing it her entire life. Pretending not to notice her father's debt collectors at the door. Pretending she wasn't exhausted. Pretending that working double shifts in a restaurant rented out for the night by men with guns near the exits was just another Tuesday. The restaurant was called Le Vieux Port. It sat on the edge of Marseille's old port like it had always been there, which it had, dark wood paneling, low lighting, the smell of aged wine and something that might have been rosemary or might have been trouble. Tonight the dining room belonged to one man. Raviel Zoric had booked every table, every chair, every shadow in the room. He was not the kind of man who shared space. Mireille had heard his name before working at Le Vieux Port. You couldn't live in certain parts of Marseille and not hear it. Raviel Zoric. Crime boss. Shipping routes. Money that moved quietly through the port like fog. He was not famous the way celebrities are famous. He was famous the way a storm system is famous. Not because anyone wanted to talk about it but because you needed to know it was coming. Tonight he sat at the center table, dressed in charcoal gray, his posture loose and controlled at the same time. The posture of a man who had never once been truly surprised in his life. Across from him sat Sandro Valles, a shipping magnate from Valencia with a wide smile and narrow eyes. The kind of smile that showed all his teeth. The kind of eyes that showed none of himself. They were deep into the meal when Mireille arrived with the second bottle of red. The conversation stopped for exactly 1 second while she poured, then resumed the moment she stepped back. She had already learned that evening. These men spoke freely around the staff. They considered people like her part of the furniture. She didn't mind. Furniture heard everything. By 8 o'clock she had counted 4 armed men, 2 near the main entrance, 1 by the kitchen corridor, 1 near the window that overlooked the alley. They were dressed well enough to pass for bodyguards at a corporate event, but their eyes moved differently. They didn't watch the room the way security watches a room, cataloging threats and exits. They watched specific points, specific people, and they checked in with each other through glances that said everything without saying anything at all. Mireille had grown up in a neighborhood where that kind of communication was its own language. She understood it completely and wanted nothing to do with it. The evening had started at 6. Mireille had come in for her shift to find the restaurant transformed. Regular customers turned away, the usual staff reduced to a skeleton crew of 3. Her manager, a nervous man named Bernard, had pulled her aside in the kitchen and told her to keep her head down, speak only when spoken to, and under no circumstances make eye contact with the men standing near the doors. She had nodded. She needed this job. Her father had died 14 months ago, leaving behind nothing except the kind of debt that follows a family like a shadow. She had been doing well. Keeping her head down. Moving fast, staying quiet, refilling glasses before they were empty, the perfect invisible waitress. And then she had crouched beside Raviel's table to adjust a fold in the long white tablecloth, and her fingers had brushed the underside of the wood near the edge, where his right hand naturally rested. Where a man grips the table when he leans forward to make a point. Her fingers came away wet. She didn't react. That was the thing she would think about later, how she didn't react. She stood, walked calmly back toward the kitchen, set the small tray she was carrying on the counter, and looked at her fingers in the dim light near the dish station. A clear, slightly sticky film. Almost nothing. You would never see it unless you were looking. You would never look unless you happened to touch it. And then the memory hit her like cold water. 2 years ago her brother Tomas had been working a cleanup job at a marine facility near the docks. Industrial solvent. A colorless gel used to strip barnacle buildup from boat hulls. He had touched a surface that hadn't been properly flagged, absorbed enough through his palm over 3 hours of work, and ended up in the hospital 4 days later with his kidneys beginning to fail. The doctors had explained it carefully. The compound entered through skin contact. Slow. Silent. By the time symptoms appeared, it had already been working for hours. It didn't announce itself. It mimicked natural organ failure so precisely that if the hospital hadn't run a specific toxicology panel, which they only ran because Tomas mentioned the solvent, they might have filed it as cardiac arrest. Mirela stood in the kitchen of Louvieux-Port with her fingers held slightly away from her body and understood exactly what she had touched under that table. She stood very still for a moment. The kitchen noise continued around her. The clatter of plates, Bernard muttering about timing, one of the other servers asking where the extra wine opener had gone. All of it normal. All of it completely separate from the thing happening inside her chest, which was a slow, spreading coldness that had nothing to do with temperature. She rinsed her hand. Twice. Then she stood at the dish station for 90 seconds. She counted, and made herself think clearly. The gel was on Raviel's side of the table. Not Sandro's. Raviel gripped that edge constantly. She had watched him all evening, the unconscious habit of a man who talked with his whole body, one hand finding the table the way another person might find a railing. He would do it a dozen more times before the dinner ended. By midnight he would leave this restaurant feeling fine. By tomorrow morning, the organs would be losing the quiet war already begun inside them. By the time anyone thought to look for a cause, the gel would be gone, the table wiped clean, and Raviel Zoric's death would be filed under heart failure. Natural causes. She thought about walking to one of Raviel's security men near the door. She thought about it for 4 seconds and abandoned it. Sandro's men were closer to Raviel than his own. She had watched the seating arrangement all evening. Sandro had maneuvered it, she realized now. His people were positioned between Raviel and the exits, between Raviel and his own staff, between Raviel and every route that wasn't the one Sandro controlled. If she approached the wrong man, she would be escorted out the back and the dinner would continue exactly as planned. She thought about saying nothing. She could leave the restaurant at the end of her shift. She could go home. She could tell herself she wasn't sure, that she might be wrong, that it wasn't her business, that powerful men like Raviel Zoric made enemies for reasons she would never understand, and that wasn't her fault. She could sleep tonight and find out tomorrow that a famous criminal had died at port, and think about her brother's hospital room and know, for the rest of her life, that she had been 3 feet away and said nothing. She picked up the wine bottle and walked back into the dining room. The 2 men were laughing at something. Sandro had his hand flat on the table, telling a story with the enthusiasm of a man who had already won. Raviel was listening with half his attention, the other half somewhere else. Somewhere calm and distant, the way a chess player looks when they're already 4 moves ahead. His right hand rested near the edge of the table, a centimeter from the gel. Mirela moved around the far side, came to Raviel's right, leaned in at the precise angle of a waitress adjusting a glass. Her hand was steady. She would think about that later too, how completely steady her hand was. She reached for his glass, tilted it slightly, and leaned close enough that her words would go nowhere except directly into the 6 inches of air between her mouth and his ear. She did not move her lips more than necessary. "Sir," she said. "Look under the table. Don't touch it." He stepped back. Set the bottle down. Moved toward the other side of the room as if nothing had happened. She did not look at him. He did not look at Sandro. She looked at the far wall and kept walking at exactly the same pace she always walked, and she felt the back of her neck go cold because she could not see what Raviel did next, and she would not know for at least another 30 seconds whether he had heard her, whether he believed her, or whether one of Sandro's men had been watching her lips. 30 seconds became a minute. She refilled a water glass near the window. She straightened a napkin that didn't need straightening. She kept her breathing even. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw Raviel reach into his jacket pocket for nothing in particular, pause, and then let his linen napkin slide from his lap to the floor. He bent to retrieve it. The bend was casual, the slightly annoyed motion of a man bothered by a minor inconvenience. He was down for no more than 4 seconds. When he came back up, his napkin was in his hand and his expression had not changed by a single degree. He set the napkin on his knee. He continued his conversation with Sandro. He reached for his wine glass with his left hand, not his right. And when he leaned forward a moment later to make a point, both hands clasped together behind the small of his back, leaving the table untouched. Sandro noticed. It was a small thing. Barely anything, the difference between a man gripping a table and a man not gripping a table. But Sandro noticed because he had been watching for something specific, and the specific thing he had been watching for was Raviel touching that table. The wide smile stayed on his face, but something in it went rigid. His eyes moved once quickly around the room. Raviel didn't look at Mirela. He didn't look at the table. He looked directly at Sandro Valles and said in the tone of a man discussing the weather, "Strange." I was warned not to touch anything tonight. The room didn't change temperature. They didn't need to. The silence that followed Raviel's words was the kind of silence that has weight to it, the kind that presses against your ears. Sandro laughed. It was a good laugh. Practiced, warm, hitting all the right notes. Warned, he said. By who? Raviel turned his gaze across the table and held it there for a moment before he spoke again. You'd be surprised, he said. Who pays attention? He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Somewhere near the back wall, one of his men, who had been standing beside a floor lamp for the past 2 hours without drawing any attention, moved to the side of the table. In his hand was a white cloth. He ran it slowly along the underside of the wood near Raviel's chair. He held it up. In the low candlelight, the cloth showed a faint stain. Colorless and sticky and unmistakably there. Test it, Raviel said. What followed was not loud. That was the thing Mireille would remember most about the next 10 minutes. How quiet it was. A man came in from outside whom she had not seen before. He moved to the table with a small case. He worked quickly. He spoke to Raviel in a low voice, and she was across the room and couldn't hear the words. But she saw Raviel nod once, slowly, the nod of a man receiving information he had already prepared himself to receive. Sandro stood. Or tried to. 2 men were already behind him. No hands were raised. No voices. He was simply redirected. Escorted toward the back in trance with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this kind of thing before and found that stillness served better than force. Sandro said something as he moved toward the door. Mireille couldn't hear that either. She watched his face, the wide smile gone, the narrow eyes showing something for the first time all evening. Something real. The back door opened and closed. For a moment the dining room was completely silent. Raviel stood beside the table, both hands loose at his sides, his expression the same steady, unreadable thing it had been all evening. He looked at the remaining men in the room, his men, and something passed between them without words. Then he reached into his inside jacket pocket and produced a handkerchief, and he used it to carefully, methodically wipe the back of his right hand, which had not touched the table all evening, and he set the handkerchief on the table and did not pick it up again. It was the most deliberate gesture Mireille had ever seen. The dinner was over. Bernard appeared from the kitchen, visibly shaking. He told the remaining staff to begin clearing without making eye contact with anyone. Mireille started collecting glasses from a side table, her movements automatic, her mind very quiet and very loud at the same time. She was almost to the kitchen door when one of Raviel's men stepped into her path. Not aggressively. He simply stood there and looked at her, and then looked toward the staircase at the back of the room and said, Mr. Zorich would like a word. She followed him upstairs. The office was small and looked lived in. Not the showroom office of a man performing power, but the actual working space of someone who spent real time in it. Papers. A coat draped over a chair. A window overlooking the port where the lights of the harbor smeared across the dark water. Raviel was standing near the window with his back to her when she entered. He turned. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at most things. Not unkindly but completely, the way you look at something you are trying to understand rather than something you already have an opinion about. How did you know? He asked. She told him. All of it. Her brother Tomas. The marine facility. The hospital. The specific texture of the gel and the way it absorbed. She told him she hadn't been certain, not 100%. And that she had stood in the kitchen for 90 seconds debating whether to say anything at all. She told him that what decided her wasn't loyalty or calculation or anything strategic. It was the thought of the other staff. Bernard and the 2 other servers. If Raviel had died tonight and the investigation came, they would have been the first people questioned. The people who served the food, poured the wine, handled everything near that table. People with no protection and no money for lawyers and no way to prove they hadn't known. She told him she hadn't warned him for a reward. He nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she noticed for the first time that he looked tired. Not physically but the other kind. The kind that lives behind the eyes. You saw, he said, what trained men missed. He offered her a position. Not as a waitress. Something within his operations, something close, something protected. He said the word, protection, the way people say it when they mean it. Not as a threat veiled in generosity but as an actual thing he could provide. She said no. She said it clearly and without apology, and she watched to see if the no would change the temperature of the room the way it might have with certain men. It didn't. Raviel Zorik simply looked at her and waited, and she understood that he was genuinely curious what she would ask for instead. There was something almost disorienting about it. The way he received her refusal without machinery, without charm deployed like a tool, without any of the mechanisms powerful men usually reach for when they don't get the answer they expected. He just waited. Like a man who had enough patience that he could afford to let other people find their own words. The staff, she said. Bernard and the others. They had nothing to do with any of this. They should be able to come back to work tomorrow and not be afraid. He was quiet for a moment. Agreed, he said. She left the office the same way she had come up, by the staircase, past the now empty dining room where the candles were being extinguished one by one. She collected her coat from the staff room. She walked out through the kitchen door into the cool Marseille night and stood on the cobblestones of the old port for a moment, breathing the salt air, listening to the harbor. She went home. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time without turning on the lights. She thought about Thomas in the hospital, the way his skin had gone yellow before they knew what was wrong. She thought about her father's debts and the men who came to collect them and how different they were from Raviel Zorik. Louder, more obviously dangerous, less frightening somehow for it. She thought about the moment her fingers had come away from the underside of that table and how close she had come to simply wiping her hand on her apron and walking away. How the whole night had balanced on a memory she hadn't chosen to keep and a decision she hadn't fully made until it was already made. He was not a brave person. He was certain of that. She was a person who had done a specific thing at a specific moment, and whether that was bravery or stubbornness or just the refusal to be the kind of person who watched something happen and said nothing, she didn't know. She didn't particularly need to know. She sat in the dark kitchen until she was tired enough to sleep, and then she slept. 2 weeks later, Mireille left Marseille. There was money in an envelope that had been placed inside her locker at the restaurant. No name, no note, no explanation required. She did not tell anyone where it came from. She took a train south, then a ferry, then another train, moving toward a life she had been trying to afford for 3 years and could now quietly begin. She never publicly accepted anything from anyone. She never told the story. She went to work in a small restaurant in a different city and poured wine for ordinary people who did not have men with guns near the exits, and she was glad for the boredom of it. Raviel Zorik remained in power. Sandro Valles disappeared from the port negotiations permanently, not dramatically the way powerful men sometimes vanish, but quietly, in the way of someone who has been told clearly and without room for interpretation that a particular chapter of their life has ended. The shipping routes were renegotiated. Business continued. The dark machinery of the port kept turning. And in certain circles, in the particular kind of conversation that happens at the end of a meal, in low voices, in rooms where the right people are present, a story began to circulate. Not a loud story. Not a legend. Just a quiet piece of information passed between people who understood what it meant. A man had been targeted with the patience and precision of someone who had planned for every variable. Except one. A waitress with steady hands and a memory she hadn't known she would ever need. She had leaned in close enough to be heard and said 4 words. And because he was the kind of man who had survived as long as he had by knowing the difference between noise and signal, between distraction and truth, between the people who wanted something from him and the people who simply saw something they could not ignore, he had listened. In the end, that was the whole story. I have been away for a while and I want to be honest with you about why. I was not just taking a break. I was learning. I was studying, researching, and putting in the work to make sure that everything I bring to this channel from here on out is worth your time. You have given me your attention and I take that seriously. I did not want to come back with the same thing. I wanted to come back with something better. And that is exactly what I plan to deliver. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it kept you watching until the very last word, then you already know what this channel is about. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell. Because what is coming next is going to be worth the wait. I promise you that.